The story begins not in the bustling streets of Athens, but in the flickering silence of a forgotten temple beneath Mount Hymettus. It's 322 BCE, the year Aristotle dies. And yet, what his followers find hidden among his final writings is something so dangerous, so blasphemous, that they choose to bury it forever. They called it Psyche's Aporton, the forbidden treatise on the soul. For centuries, Aristotle was known as the philosopher who sought reason in all things. He dissected the heavens, the earth, and even the human mind. But what if he went too far? What if he wrote something that defied both the gods and his own teacher, Plato? According to legend, when the philosopher's students opened the sealed scrolls in his study, they found a theory that could destroy the very foundation of Greek religion. A theory that claimed the soul was not divine, not immortal, but a temporary illusion of matter. The soul, Aristotle supposedly wrote, is not a visitor in the body, it is the body organized. If that were true, it meant the afterlife was a lie, the oracles were deceivers, and the priests who spoke of eternal judgment were merely keepers of comforting myths. So how did a philosopher who spent his life defining logic, science, and virtue end up writing the most forbidden document of the ancient world? To understand that, we must return to the world that shaped him. Athens in the shadow of empire, where thought was both a weapon and a crime. The city was a paradox. It worshipped wisdom, yet executed Socrates for thinking too freely. It built temples to reason, but silenced those who questioned the soul's divinity. When Aristotle returned from studying under Plato, he found a city torn between faith and philosophy, between myth and evidence. Plato's teaching had ruled Greek thought for decades, that the soul was eternal, imprisoned in the body, awaiting release to a higher realm. It was comforting, poetic, and untouchable. But Aristotle saw cracks in that perfection. He began asking questions no one dared to speak aloud. If the soul is immortal, why does it forget its past lives? Why does injury to the brain change a man's character if the soul is separate? And why do all living things die if something divine resides within? Each question was a hammer striking at the pillars of Plato's academy. Rumors spread that Aristotle was dissecting the sacred. In his lectures, he replaced myth with observation, revelation with experiment. He studied animals, plants, and the human body, searching not for gods, but for patterns. And one night, while watching a dying soldier take his final breath, he noticed something others ignored, the exact moment when life turned to stillness. It wasn't a mystical release of spirit. It was the fading of a process, like a flame losing fuel. From that moment, the idea took hold in his mind. Perhaps the soul wasn't a ghost inside us. Perhaps it was the organization of life itself. But to write that down, to claim the soul was mortal, was unthinkable. It would make him an enemy of the temples and a heretic among philosophers. So he concealed it. He encoded the idea in obscure language within his official works, and in a secret draft, the forbidden scroll, he spoke plainly. Centuries later, Andronicus of Rhodes, the man who compiled Aristotle's surviving texts, would write that some works were withheld, for they were dangerous to faith and state. Was he referring to this? The lost treatise on the soul that Aristotle's followers swore never to reveal? If so, what exactly did it say? What truth was so threatening that even the philosopher's own disciples chose silence over revelation? That question, buried for 2 millennia, would resurface only when fragments of a mysterious papyrus were unearthed near Pergamon, bearing words attributed to the master himself. When the body dies, the soul dies with it. What is left is memory in others, not in heaven. Could this truly be Aristotle's voice echoing across time? Or a forgery crafted by those who wish to destroy his legacy? The answer lies not in what he wrote, but in why he may have written it. It was said that Aristotle feared only two things: ignorance and superstition. Both, he believed, chained the human mind to illusion. Yet in Athens, illusion was sacred, woven into the fabric of daily life. The temples, the rituals, and the promise of immortality whispered by priests of Apollo. The Greek world had long worshipped the soul as something divine, a spark borrowed from the gods themselves. Every funeral was an echo of this belief, the burning of the body, the rising smoke said to carry the spirit upward. But Aristotle watched those flames with skepticism. He began to see the rituals not as sacred truth, but as mankind's refusal to face its own mortality. In his secret notes, fragments that scholars later believed to be part of his lost scroll, Aristotle wrote, "Man fears not death, but the silence that follows." To comfort himself, he invents eternity. It was a dangerous observation. To deny the divine soul was to strip power from the oracles, priesthoods, and even the political systems that thrived on fear of divine punishment. It was treason against both religion and rule. And yet, Aristotle continued. In 335 BCE, he founded his own school, the Lyceum. Unlike Plato's Academy, where philosophy drifted toward mysticism, the Lyceum was a place of motion and measurement. His students, called peripatetics, followed him as he walked under the colonnades, debating, questioning, dissecting truth itself. There, Aristotle divided the soul into three parts: the vegetative, the sensitive, and the rational. But he warned that these were not separate spirits, merely functions of life itself. The vegetative soul allowed plants to grow, the sensitive made animals move, and the rational gave humans thought. When the organism died, those functions ceased, just as the flame ceases when its fuel is spent. He called this the hylomorphic theory, that the body, hyle, and form, morphe, together create the soul. Without the body, there is no vessel. Without the vessel, no flame. The soul was not immortal. It was immanently bound to flesh. This idea quietly dismantled centuries of religious tradition. No heaven, no eternal self, only matter organized and animated by nature. But the whispers began. The priests of Eleusis, the keepers of sacred mysteries, accused him of corrupting the youth with impiety masked as science. His enemies claimed he sought to unmake the gods. The Athenian assembly, still haunted by the memory of Socrates' trial, began to murmur, "Another blasphemer walks among us." Even his students trembled. Theophrastus, his most loyal disciple, begged him to destroy the forbidden treatise, warning, "Master, if they read your words, they will think you deny the soul itself." But Aristotle only smiled, a tired smile touched with irony. "The truth does not fear the gods," he said, "only men do." Still, danger was closing in. Macedonia, Aristotle's homeland, had conquered Greece under Alexander the Great, his former pupil. And though Alexander admired his old mentor, the philosopher's growing influence made him a political threat. The Athenians whispered that Aristotle's teachings on the mortal soul were a plot to weaken faith, to turn citizens away from the gods of the polis. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, those whispers grew into shouts. Anti-Macedonian sentiment surged, and Aristotle, seen as an ally of the conqueror, became an easy target. He was accused of asabeia, impiety, the same crime that had condemned Socrates. The charges were clear. He has corrupted philosophy and dishonored the divine soul. Aristotle fled Athens, declaring, "I will not allow the city to sin twice against philosophy." He took refuge in Chalcis, on the island of Euboea, where he lived out his final year. There, surrounded by the sea's slow breathing, he wrote feverishly, letters, fragments, and perhaps the last version of his forbidden manuscript. Some claimed he burned it before his death, fearful that his theory would destroy his reputation. Others swore he hid it among his private papers, trusting his disciples to guard it until mankind was ready to understand. And yet, centuries later, an Alexandrian scholar would describe a lost text of Aristotle that spoke of the soul as mortal and the gods as metaphors. A heretical document known only as the Second Anima. Was this the same forbidden scroll his students swore to hide? If so, how did it survive the flames of time? And where did it go after his death? Some believe the answer lies with Theophrastus, who inherited the master's works and protected them from a world not yet ready to hear their truth. But not all disciples were loyal. One, driven by ambition and envy, would betray Aristotle's final wish and unleash his forbidden philosophy upon the wrong hands. When Aristotle died in 322 BCE, the world of reason trembled. The Lyceum, once alive with debate and discovery, fell into a heavy silence. The master was gone, but his teachings still burned like embers, waiting for the wrong breath to fan them into fire. His most trusted student, Theophrastus, inherited the school and all of Aristotle's manuscripts. Among them were papers sealed in wax, marked only with the symbol of the phoenix, Aristotle's private cipher. Those were the writings he had warned never to publish, his personal reflections on the soul, God, and death. For years, Theophrastus kept them hidden in a bronze chest beneath the Lyceum's library, accessible only to a handful of disciples sworn to secrecy. But secrets have a way of leaking, especially when knowledge itself is power. One of these disciples was Demetrius of Phalerum, a clever politician, philosopher, and orator, admired in public, envied in private. He had once ruled Athens under Macedonian favor, but when fortune turned against him, he sought redemption through discovery. He believed Aristotle's hidden scroll could restore his prestige, if he could claim its contents as his own. He began to probe Theophrastus's circle with quiet questions. What if the master's final theory could explain the soul's origin? What if it could redefine divinity itself? Theophrastus avoided him. He sensed danger. But Demetrius was persistent, and in the shadows of the Lyceum's marble halls, he found an accomplice, Straton of Lampsacus, another student known for his obsession with physics and the natural order. Together, they began a silent rebellion, not against Theophrastus, but against myth itself. Straton argued that Aristotle's forbidden theory was the key to freeing philosophy from superstition. If the world knew the truth, that the soul dies with the body, then humanity could finally live without fear of gods or punishment. Demetrius saw opportunity. Straton saw liberation. One stormy night, when Theophrastus was away in Lesbos, Demetrius descended into the archives with a lamp and a stolen key. The chest opened with a whisper. Inside were scrolls wrapped in oiled linen, their ink fading but their message immortal. He unrolled the first one and read words that made his breath tremble. The soul is the act of the body as the flame is the act of the lamp. When the vessel is shattered, the light departs, not to another world, but into nothingness. It was Aristotle's unmistakable style, precise, patient, ruthless in logic. There was no mysticism, no divine rescue, only a clear statement. The soul was mortal. Demetrius understood instantly why this had been hidden. If such words spread, temples would empty, priests would lose their authority, and the ancient foundation of Greek morality would collapse. He copied the scroll by hand, concealing it among his own writings before sealing the chest again. Days later, he fled Athens, taking his version with him to Alexandria, where a new empire of knowledge was rising. In Alexandria, Demetrius found a willing audience. The city, newly founded by Alexander the Great, was becoming the beating heart of learning, home to the Library of Alexandria, a wonder of the ancient world. There, he presented himself to Ptolemy Isoter Alexander's general turned pharaoh, and offered what he claimed to be Aristotle's lost revelations. Ptolemy, always hungry for wisdom to legitimize his rule, welcomed him as a scholar and counselor. Under Demetrius's influence, the first library began collecting every manuscript it could find from Greece, Persia, Egypt, and India. And among its secret collection was a copy of Aristotle's forbidden soul theory. But not everyone in Alexandria shared his enthusiasm. The Egyptian priests saw in those words an echo of impiety, a foreign philosopher denying the Ka, the eternal essence of man. They warned Ptolemy that such heresies could provoke the gods themselves. So the scroll was locked away deep in the restricted wing of the library, filed under a false name, De Spiritu Naturae. Few ever saw it again. Back in Athens, Theophrastus eventually discovered the theft. He found the wax seal broken, the scrolls rearranged, the chest disturbed. But by then, it was too late. Demetrius was gone, and whispers of a mortal soul were already spreading among scholars. Heartbroken, Theophrastus wrote to a friend, "The master shadow has been betrayed. The truth he hid to protect men from madness is now in the hands of those who seek glory." To protect Aristotle's legacy, Theophrastus ordered the remaining forbidden works sealed again, this time buried beneath the Lyceum itself. He told his students never to speak of them, for some truths must sleep until the world grows wiser. But the world would not sleep. Knowledge, once unchained, has a way of resurfacing, especially when it dares to question the soul. And centuries later, when the Library of Alexandria stood at its zenith, the forbidden scroll would reappear in the hands of man whose obsession with truth would rival Aristotle himself, a philosopher named Galen. Galen would not only read the scroll, he would try to prove it. 2 centuries after Aristotle's death, the world had changed, but his shadow had not faded. The Roman Empire now ruled where Greece once dreamed, and the city of Alexandria had become the empire's beating heart of science and philosophy. In the marble corridors of its library, where the air itself seemed alive with ink and parchment, a man named Galen of Pergamon walked with purpose. He was no ordinary scholar. He was the empire's most brilliant physician, surgeon, and philosopher, a man who believed the body was a map of the cosmos itself. But beneath his calm precision, Galen carried an obsession, the nature of the soul. From the scrolls of Hippocrates, he learned the art of healing. From Plato, he inherited the idea of a divine, immortal essence. But from Aristotle, he sensed something different, something dangerous. While studying the Lyceum's surviving works, Galen stumbled upon a curious reference in a catalog of forbidden texts, De Spiritu Naturae, on the spirit of nature. It was anonymous, attributed to no known philosopher. Yet as he began reading, he felt the unmistakable voice of the Stagirite echoing through the centuries. The soul is not an immortal essence, but the harmony of motion and thought within living flesh. The sentence struck him like lightning. This was no ordinary commentary. It was Aristotle's lost scroll, the one whispered about in academic circles, but long thought destroyed. For days, Galen read in secret, tracing the philosopher's reasoning with trembling hands. He saw Aristotle not as a mystic, but as an anatomist of existence, describing life as a biological phenomenon, not a divine one. The scroll described how consciousness arises not from heaven, but from the brain's organization, how memory decays when the body falters, and how the illusion of self is a flame that flickers only as long as the vessel holds. To Galen, this was not blasphemy. It was revelation. At last, philosophy and medicine spoke the same language. But revelation always comes with a price. In Alexandria, the priests of Serapis and Isis held enormous power. Their temples thrived on the promise that the Ka, the eternal soul, lived beyond death. A theory like Aristotle's could destroy their influence, and Galen knew it. Yet he couldn't stay silent. He began testing the idea through anatomy and experiment. Dissecting animals, he noted that when the brain was damaged, perception vanished. When the heart stopped, the so-called divine spark disappeared instantly. In his private journals, he wrote, "If the soul is divine, it should persist when the flesh fails." Yet in every test, it fails with the flesh. He had done what few dared. He sought proof of Aristotle's forbidden claim. Word spread quickly through Alexandria's intellectual circles. Some hailed him as a genius uniting philosophy and medicine. Others called him a man who cuts the gods open. By the time the priests learned of his experiments, it was too late. The rumors had already reached Rome. When Galen was summoned to the imperial court, he feared execution. Instead, he found a curious ally, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, himself a philosopher king. The emperor questioned him privately. "Tell me, physician, do you believe the soul dies with the body?" Galen hesitated. The fate of his life, and perhaps Aristotle's legacy, hung on his answer. He finally said, "Majesty, I believe the soul lives as long as the body does its work. It dies when the work is done." Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic, smiled faintly. "Then you speak of duty, not divinity. Perhaps there is wisdom in that." The emperor allowed him to continue his studies under discreet protection. But he warned, "Let this truth live in whispers. The people are not ready to see the gods bleed." Under that fragile tolerance, Galen continued to build upon Aristotle's heretical model. He described how the nervous system carried motion and thought, how the heart was not the seat of the soul, as Plato claimed, but merely a pump sustaining life. And though he never dared to publish Aristotle's lost treatise, he incorporated its essence into his medical works, coded in cautious language, disguised as physiology. He wrote, "The soul is that which the body does when it is most alive." It was a poetic echo of Aristotle's own line. The soul is the form of the living body. To most readers, it seemed an elegant metaphor. To those who knew better, it was a cipher, a continuation of the forbidden truth. But the danger returned when Christian scholars began translating Galen's text centuries later. To them, the idea of a mortal soul was an abomination. In the newly forming Christian theology, the soul was immortal by divine decree, non-negotiable. And so, the parts of Galen's writings that hinted at Aristotle's forbidden theory were quietly omitted, burned, or rewritten. The Church declared, "Man is body and immortal spirit." To say otherwise is to deny God himself. By the 4th century CE, the forbidden theory vanished once more, erased from libraries, its fragments buried beneath centuries of theological rule. Yet the idea refused to die. Like an ember beneath ashes, it waited, until another age of reason would dig it up again. That age would come in Renaissance Italy, when scholars searching for lost Greek texts stumbled upon a peculiar manuscript copied in fading Greek script, bearing Aristotle's unmistakable name and a single chilling title, On the Mortal Soul. It was the year 1492 CE, and the world was being reborn. Empires expanded, stars were mapped, and ancient secrets were pulled from the dust of forgotten monasteries. In Padua, a young scholar named Niccolò Leonico Tomeo, a translator of Greek philosophy, found himself staring at a parchment that shouldn't have existed. The faded ink bore a name he knew too well, Aristotle's. But beneath it, the title chilled him, Peripsyches Thnetes, On the Mortal Soul. The manuscript had arrived from Mount Athos, smuggled by monks who didn't understand its content. They thought it was another commentary on Aristotle's De Anima, his well-known treatise on the soul. But Tomeo knew better the moment he began to read. The writing was different, darker, more personal. It wasn't the cautious philosopher lecturing to students. It was a man at war with himself, confronting the boundaries between faith and knowledge. The first line read, "The gods are not eternal, nor are we. All forms fade, all flames extinguish, and the memory of man becomes his only afterlife." It was unmistakable, the same voice that had once whispered through Alexandria and Athens. The lost scroll of Aristotle's forbidden theory had resurfaced. Tomio's hands trembled. He knew what this meant. To publish it would ignite the wrath of the Church, which ruled Europe's mind as the temples once ruled Greece's. To hide it would betray the very spirit of philosophy. He made his choice. Under the flickering candlelight of his study, Tomio translated every word, concealing the text inside a collection of harmless Aristotelian commentaries. He noted how Aristotle described the soul not as a divine spark, but as the perfection of natural form, a state of harmony achieved when body and mind act in unity. When that unity dissolves, the text declared, the soul ceases, not to suffer, not to awaken, but to rest. To the medieval mind, this was heresy beyond comprehension. The soul's mortality denied heaven, hell, and salvation. If Aristotle was right, the Church's entire cosmology trembled. Yet, as Tomio translated, he couldn't help but feel, or rather than fear. He saw in those lines a philosopher who had dared to face the ultimate truth, that mortality is not punishment, but the natural rhythm of existence. By 1508, whispers of the mortal soul manuscript reached the Vatican. Tomio was summoned for questioning by the Inquisition. They asked if he had read forbidden Greek texts, especially those questioning divine immortality. He lied. He said it was only commentary on natural philosophy. But the inquisitors weren't convinced. That night, fearing arrest, Tomio gave the original scroll to his friend Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, the famed humanist philosopher. Pico, fascinated by the fusion of science and spirit, hid the manuscript among his private notes, writing beside it, "If this is truly Aristotle's, then truth has slept 2,000 years." Weeks later, Pico died under mysterious circumstances. Poison, some said. The manuscript vanished again, this time into the labyrinth of private collections and hidden archives that would later feed the Renaissance's hunger for forbidden knowledge. Centuries passed. The world changed again. But Aristotle's forbidden theory, his quiet defiance of divinity, never truly disappeared. It resurfaced in whispers among Enlightenment thinkers who rejected superstition. It shaped the birth of modern psychology and the idea that mind and body are inseparable. And it lived on in every scientist who dared to ask not what the soul is, but how it works. When Charles Darwin wrote that life evolves through natural order, not divine design, he echoed Aristotle's logic. When Freud mapped the unconscious as a construct of the body, he unknowingly walked the path Aristotle began. Every step toward understanding consciousness, every MRI, every neuron mapped, traces back to that moment under the olive trees of Athens, when one man watched a dying soldier's final breath and saw not a god departing, but nature completing its cycle. In the end, Aristotle's forbidden theory was not an act of blasphemy. It was an act of courage, the courage to replace myth with meaning, to say that life's sanctity does not need eternity, only understanding. And those words were hidden, burned, and buried for centuries. They survived because truth, once spoken, cannot die. Perhaps Aristotle himself foresaw this when he wrote in his final lines, "The soul's immortality is not in heaven. It is in thought, passed from one mind to another." That thought still breathes today, 2,000 years later, whenever we ask the oldest question of all. What are we, if not the fleeting miracle of being alive? References for description and accuracy: Aristotle, De Anima, on the Soul, translated by J. Smith, Oxford Classical Texts. Diogenes Laertius, Lives of Eminent Philosophers, Book V, Andronicus of Rhodes, Fragments on the Aristotelian Corpus. Galen, On the Natural Faculties, and De Placidis Hippocrates et Platonis. Theophrastus, Fragments and Commentaries on Aristotle. Pierre Pellegrin, Aristotle's Biology and the Philosophy of Soul, Cambridge University Press. Jonathan Barnes, Aristotle, A Very Short Introduction, Oxford University Press. G. R. Lloyd, Aristotle, The Growth and Structure of His Thought, Cambridge. Stephen Mann, Aristotle and the Stoics on Soul and Nature, Harvard University Press. David Charles, Aristotle on Meaning and Essence, Oxford University Press.